especially with Shelley. Like, I actually am allergic to it. I'm convinced. I have allergic reactions, all kinds of allergic reactions when we have conflict. My heart palpitates, and I get knots in my stomach, and I can't think straight, and I'm convinced that there's some kind of thing medically that goes wrong in my body when we have conflict. So today when we talk about conflict, there's a sense of urgency for me that I need to figure this out. So I'm going to take us back to the very beginning, and we're going to look at what the Bible has to say about the beginning of this whole thing. And the reason we're using the Bible is because if you look at all ancient literature, the Bible is way far and away the most reliable ancient document of any kind, including sacred and non-sacred documents. And it stood the test of time for centuries. And so we're going to look at this as a launching pad for what we want to talk about this morning. So we're going to go back to the very first book of the Bible, and it's called Genesis, and we're going to look at Genesis 3:16. So Genesis 3:16. There it says, "Then he," and this is God that's talking about, "said to the woman, 'I will sharpen the pain of your pregnancy, and in pain you will give birth, and you will desire to control your husband, and he will rule over you.'" So here's the deal. When God created man, he put him in the Garden of Eden. He created Adam first, and he gave him only one rule to keep. He said, "You can do anything you like except one thing." And that was to eat of this certain tree. And I mean, you'd think with a whole garden and all the provisions of life that he had and all of that, that it would be pretty easy to follow that one stipulation. And then God created the woman, and then from what we can gather from the story, God was hoping that Adam would tell her what he had told him, so that she would understand that that tree was off limits. But if you read the story, and I encourage you to read the story, I encourage you to read all of the Bible, because it's very good, important stuff to help you live your life well. But it appears as if she didn't get the memo, because she didn't quite understand this. And so she gets tempted to eat this fruit, and she takes the fruit, and she eats it, and she gives it to Adam, and I mean, he should have known better, but you know how it is when your wife is wanting you to do something. And so he eats the fruit, and lo and behold, they realize they've made a terrible mistake, and we all make mistakes, and the reality is we all always have consequences when we don't do things the way God wants us to do it. Whether we like it or not, there's always consequences. And, you know, we can pretend that we're getting away with stuff or whatever, but we're just pretending. We all know that. And so here they are now reaping the consequences of their actions. And so there's consequences for Adam, and then here are the consequences for Eve, the woman. And so the first consequence has to do with childbearing and so on, and we're not going to get into that here today, but all of you ladies that have had kids, you know that it doesn't happen just nice and easy. And then the second consequence was tension between husbands and wives. So up until this point, it appears as if there was perfect harmony in their relationship with each other. You know, they got along, they were able to do things conflict-free, and now all of a sudden they are in a position where conflict happens. And the interesting thing here is that basically what God is saying is, from now on, the woman is going to want to control the man, and the man is going to want to control the woman. So it's almost as if, up until this point, they were working together as a team, and then after this point, they are in competition with each other, and it's a power struggle. Who gets to decide? Who gets to dominate the other person? Who gets to dominate the family? Who gets to dominate the relationship? And that is the result of disobeying God this time. Now, whenever you disobey God in some way, there's always consequences. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to get to know God, to understand how He thinks, so that you can align your life with the way He designed you to live. If you don't even know God, you don't have any interest in God or whatever, you are going to constantly be bumping up against things like this and just be reaping the consequences of walking out of alignment with God, but not even realize why. I don't know if you've been in that situation, but I've been in that situation before where things just aren't working. You know, like Dr. Phil says, how's that working for you? You know, it's just not working, and I just can't understand why. And then later I realize, oh, that's because I'm not aligning myself with the way God designed me to function. And so if you're in the situation today where you're kind of going, you know what, I don't know if I really even have a relationship with God. Well, you can have a relationship with God. Actually, it's very, very easy. That's why Jesus came. Jesus came to make it easy for us to have a relationship with God. You see, before Jesus came, it was really complicated. There was all of these hoops you had to jump through to have a relationship with God and to keep your relationship with God working. But Jesus came and He opened a pathway so that absolutely anyone who wants to have a relationship with God can have a relationship with God. And this is how easy it is. All you have to do is say, Jesus, please come into my heart. I give you my life. Forgive my sin. Sin is talking about when we're not aligning ourselves with God. And lead me. And when you invite Him in and turn over your life that way to Jesus, He blows the door wide open for you to connect with God and have that connection. And so if you've never done that before, today could be the day you start a relationship with God. It's a beautiful thing, and I highly encourage it. So there's a number of different ways that you can do that. I mean, you can go home and do it just between you and God. Or if you like somebody to help you, we'll have the prayer team come back at the end of the service, stand right over there, and you can go over there and have them pray with you, talk with you. They'll take as long as you need to help you figure this out. The other thing you can do is just indicate on the back of your Connect card that you're inviting Jesus in, and then I'll pray for you, and if you want me to connect with you, just let me know, and I'll connect with you during the week as well. But having a relationship with Jesus is a profoundly important thing for this whole conflict thing, because we need to understand how to align ourselves with God, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So God is explaining here why. How many of you have heard the phrase, the issue is never the issue? Few of you have heard that. Whenever you have conflict, the issue is never the issue. Almost always the issue is something else. Let me tell you what the real issue is. It's what we just read in that scripture. It's power. Who gets to decide? That's the real issue. Almost invariably, when there's conflict, the real issue is who gets their way. And as long as that issue is not addressed, it's very difficult to address the other symptom of the issue. Whatever the thing was that triggered in that moment. So we're going to talk today about how to deal with the real issue and resolve the symptom issue at the same time. So let me give you a few things that don't work, first of all. So these are things that will not help the real issue. So in other words, avoid these things. The silent treatment. Don't raise your hands, but how many of you have ever done the silent treatment? Here's another one. Lecturing. Now don't elbow the person next to you, okay? But lecturing does not work. Blaming or attacking does not work. Does not help you resolve the real issue. Condescension. Really? Does not help. Threatening does not help. Name calling does not help. Criticizing does not help. Sarcasm does not help. Complaining doesn't help. Denying doesn't help. No, we're fine. I'm okay. There's not a problem. No, we're happy. I'm fine. Walking away doesn't help. Placating doesn't help. Avoiding doesn't help. Shouting doesn't help. It feels good, but it doesn't help. Using words like always and never doesn't help. Anger or rage doesn't help. Passive-aggressive behavior doesn't help. Lying doesn't help. Hitting or violence certainly doesn't help. And showing contempt doesn't help. So there's this researcher down in Western Washington University. His name is Dr. John Gottman. I highly recommend any material that you can get your hands on that he has written. He is a relationship expert. And so one of the things they have in the Western Washington University under his umbrella is something they call the Love Lab. So the Love Lab is basically an apartment that they've built inside the university, and it's got all these cameras and they record couples who come and live there for the weekend. And they analyze everything that goes on in these dynamics between these couples. And they've been doing this for over 30 years now. And Dr. John Gottman has been able to get to the point in his analyzing of couples' interactions that he can actually predict which couples will divorce with a 95% accuracy based on one thing only: how they fight. If he can watch you fight as you normally do for 15 minutes, he can tell you with 95% accuracy whether your marriage will survive or not. Whoa. Now that's pretty scary. I am not volunteering to let him analyze our marriage. But he is looking for these things that I just listed off to you. he says, when those things are part of your normal way of dealing with conflict, you increase your chances dramatically of not making it. By the way, these are not just marriage issues. Probably all of you sitting here realize these are conflict issues are not just within marriage. Maybe that's the most common within marriage where to have conflict there. But we have conflict at work. We've got conflict with friends. We got conflict with our kids. These principles apply to all of those kinds of relationships. So how you fight and how healthy you are in the way you fight is profoundly important for the health of your relationships, especially in marriage. So I'm going to talk about how to do conflict in a healthy way. And we're going to talk about 8 steps to take in order to have a healthy conflict resolution process. And Pete Scazzaro, again, has influenced me deeply in these 8 steps. So, first of all, the most important, or one of the most important things in a conflict to remember is the way you start a conflict is almost always the way it will end. So if you have a harsh startup, you're likely to have a harsh ending. But if you have a soft startup, you're likely to have a soft ending. So that's very important. So if you are feeling a sense of growing emotion that you need to deal with your spouse or with somebody, just remember, if you can start this in a humble, soft way, you're much more likely to end it on a humble, soft resolution. But if you start off with guns a-blazing, you're likely going to end up with guns a-blazing and not end up with some resolution. So I want to look at another verse from the Bible here. So this is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. It says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." So this is the very first verse in the kind of key passage from the Bible about marriage. So the very first thing that the Apostle Paul, or Saint Paul, if you will, who wrote this passage, has to say about marriage is be submissive to one another, both parties to each other. And I'm not going to get into the rest of it today. I just want to mention this, that the very first thing about conflict resolution is humility. Be humble. Now, that's easier said than done if you're mad. And most of us go into conflict resolution angry or defensive, let's face it. So, I'm going to actually suggest something here very specific about how to start a conflict resolution process. Some words to use. You might want to jot these down. My suggestion is to start your conflict with these words. If you had married someone else, this may have not bothered them at all, but it does bother me. So can we talk about this? So why do I use those words? Because that sets the tone for owning the fact that this is not a universal issue. It's not the end of the world. It's my issue, and I'm owning my part of the issue. Now, there are certain things that nobody should ever do, for sure, but a lot of the conflict that we have in our marriages are high personal issues. You know, the fact that he doesn't put the toilet seat down, or the fact that she does this or that or the other thing may not bother some spouses, and we need to acknowledge that this is not a universal thing, that is a moral issue that somehow makes you a bad person for doing this. It's a personal thing between you and I. And so that starts the conversation off in a humble way. Do you see what I'm saying here? Like, we need to avoid the shaming approach or the attacking approach. You know, to start the conflict by saying, why do you always do this? Everybody knows you can't act like that. That doesn't help, because now you're moralizing the situation and making them look like they're a bad person for somehow doing something that you personally don't like. That's not a humble approach. That's an authoritarian approach. That's an approach where you're putting yourself up to dominate the other person. Do you see what I'm going with this? Does that make sense? So the humble approach goes, I know this is my issue, but it is an issue. So we talk about this. So the second thing is, explain why this is important to you. So different people have different reasons for why things bother them. So for example, having our kids finish their supper is important to me because I feel very strongly about not wasting food. That helps your spouse understand why this is important to you. And it's not like there's not other ways of looking at this, but this happens to be their way of looking at it, and that's why this is important to them. And so understanding the underlying reasons for this can be very, very helpful. Now, at this point in the conflict, it's very important to understand the roles that we're in. The person that initiates the conflict has the floor at this point. And it's important for the other person to listen carefully at this point. So it's not, your role initially at this stage of the conflict is not to counter their arguments, not to demean them, and so on. The only thing that you want to do at this point in the conversation is make sure you are understanding them, what they're saying. So your responses could be, okay, let me make sure that I'm hearing what you're saying here. Is this really what you mean? Because listening to the other person sets the tone of humility again. You're trying to understand what the other person is doing. The other thing I just want to say as we're talking about this too is make sure that you don't mix in other issues into this and get it so complex that you forget where you started. That's a very common approach or a technique for trying to escape conflict. And so you respond, well, if we're going to talk about that, then we need to talk about this too. And all of a sudden now you're bringing in other issues and you're making it far more complicated. And if your spouse does that, or the person you have a conflict with, the right approach is to say, that is a very important issue as well, and I'd be happy to talk about that after we finish with this issue. But right now, I'd like to stay focused on this issue so that we can find a good, healthy resolution first. So keep your focus on one thing at a time so that you can move forward in a healthy and a less complicated way. Okay. Then the fourth thing, so the third thing was don't mix in other issues. The fourth thing is give at least one specific example. Because it's hard to understand exactly what you're talking about unless you're specific. So use words like, when you do blank, I feel blank. You might want to write those down. When you do X, I feel X. Now, why do I use the word feelings? I know that's scary for us as guys. But the reason I use the word feelings is because it's personal. As soon as you start to use logic or other kinds of things to convince the person to change, now you're back into the power thing. But when you're expressing how you feel about what they are doing or when something is happening, it's keeping things in a humble tone. And that's where you want to stay. And so you want to stay away from power and stay in feelings. See, love ultimately is where you want to go and how you want this to go. Okay, so the fifth thing you want to do, now you are the one that initiated this conversation, so the other person is only responding with trying to understand you at this point. So the last thing you want to do as the initiator of this conflict is ask for a very clear request. So you might want to write this down. You might use words like, would you be willing to do blank for me instead? So when you give a very clear request, what you're doing is giving the other person hope for the relationship. That you've thought through this far enough and you believe in the relationship enough to actually have a potential solution all ready to go. Doesn't mean that that's where you'll end up, but you are offering a potential solution. And that gives hope. See, if you just throw it out, you always do this, and you're an idiot, and you can't do anything right, and all of that, what are you doing? You're destroying your relationship. Because now the person goes, yeah, I guess there's no hope for us, is there? But if you give a specific request where you say, would you be willing to do this instead of that? You are offering them hope. There is a way forward here, and I've actually already thought of a way forward. So this is the point at which the conversation turns. And now the person that has been the recipient or the listener gets to respond. So step number 6, and this is very important, is stop and think for a minute about this. Don't just respond straight from the gut initially. Stop and think. And I'm going to actually take you to a scripture here that I think is very, very important. It's actually Jesus' brother, James, that says this. He says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, you must be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. And I have found, maybe you have as well, that if you follow those first 2 steps, the third one is much easier. If you listen well, and then you stop and think, maybe even pray before you speak, you're less likely to come out hot and angry. And anger doesn't help us. Now, let me say this. You may need to take a time out at this point and just say, look, I need some time to think this through, to pray about it, and so on. But I will get back to you. When is a good time for us to continue this conversation? Don't ever use that time out as a way of escape. Okay? I am allergic to conflict. This is a huge temptation for me, to buy time indefinitely. And that does not help. You need to get back to the issue and actually resolve it. Sweeping it under the carpet is not the same as conflict resolution. It's not healthy. So yes, you may need some time to process this, to think it through, and to be able to respond in a non-angry way, but don't just sweep it under the carpet. So then come back, and then you can share your feelings about it. Now, not anger feelings. Be humble, but be honest. So you're honest about how you feel about the situation, and then they will try to understand you. And then number 7, or step number 7, is respond to the specific request that they have made. So your response could be that, okay, I'm willing to do that, or I'm willing to do some of that, or your response might be, no, I'm not really willing to go down that road at all. However, how about this as a solution? So at this point, it's very important that if you're saying an absolute no to their request, that you offer an alternative solution. And if you don't have an alternative solution, then you just say, I don't have an alternative solution, but I'm willing to talk about options here. And you keep focused on what the options might be. And then you can negotiate back and forth. Maybe there's a solution that you haven't either one of you thought of yet. Or maybe there's a compromise somewhere in between somewhere. Or there's a first step in the right direction, at least, that you would be able to take. And so you find your way there. And if you can't find your way there, don't just throw your hands up in the air and go, well, this is impossible. Go get help. Come see somebody. Maybe there's a trusted friend or somebody you highly respect that you could get to help you negotiate. Maybe they would be able to offer another way of solving this that you've never thought of. Don't let things just fester under the surface. Find your way to a solution by some way, shape, or form. Just don't do it in an angry, bitter, harsh way. Now, the last step in this process is that make sure you both are in agreement with your plan before you finish the conversation. Don't assume that you are in agreement. So, I mean, this might sound awfully radical to some of you, and it certainly did to me when I first heard it the very first time. But I actually believe that writing it down, putting it on paper can be helpful. And dating it, and maybe even signing it, and saying, yes, we agreed that this is how we are going to deal with this moving forward. Because, let's face it, we are human, we're busy, we get distracted, we forget, and we fall back into old patterns. And then we forget, no, I never agreed to that. No way. But if you've written it down, you're much more likely to agree and really know what you're agreeing to. And the other thing is, the other person can go, yeah, actually, we did agree to this. See, it actually is written right here. I know it sounds kind of like, whoa, for a marriage, but actually it does work. See, sometimes you may even need to come back and revisit it and tweak it a little bit, because sometimes the way you thought it would play out doesn't actually turn out the way it is. So then you can renegotiate where you started or left off last time. And once you have that in place, now you can move on to the other issues that you feel like you need to deal with as well. And this approach keeps you focused on the issue instead of on each other in your relationship. And that is so important. It's so important to keep yourself focused on what you're talking about and not get distracted on other issues. I'll be honest with you. Shelley and I actually have this process written down on paper. and we pull it out when we have conflict to help us both stay on track so that we don't get off on tangents that become destructive for our relationship. Because we believe our marriage is actually far more important than any conflict we'll ever have. So we want to do whatever it takes to make sure that we are doing this as healthy as we possibly can. So, I want you to imagine with me a couple. And he's standing here and she's standing here. There's a table in the middle. Actually, let's move this out here. There's a table in the middle. And on this table is the issue that they're dealing with. Whatever it might be. You know, being late for church. And she's mad at him because he doesn't get himself ready on time. And so she brings this up and says, you know, I know that if you were married to other women, they probably wouldn't care whether you were ready for church on time or not, but for me it is an issue. And then she explains why and so on and so forth. So imagine with me that this is what they're trying to resolve. And let's just use military terms here for a second to explain this. So both of them got their guns pointed at the issue of being on time. And they're trying to find solutions. So they're attacking the problem until one of them says, why do I even bother talking to you? You are impossible. What has that person done in that moment? They have lifted their gun away from the problem, and they are now shooting over the problem at the other person. And what happens when you're getting shot? Well, you feel like you need to defend yourself, and you lift your gun and fire back. And now all of a sudden this has completely gotten lost because now the war has begun. And now we are shooting at each other. And what is happening here? The relationship is getting destroyed. And beloved, that's exactly what happens in most conflict situations that go sideways. We lift one person first, lifts their gun, and shoots the other person, and then the other person needs to lift their gun to defend themselves or feels they need to. And we never resolve this. All we do is destroy this. So, in a nutshell, what I'm asking you to do, and what I believe God is asking us to do, is to keep our guns pointed at this instead of lifting them and shooting at each other. That's the bottom line. That's really a very simplified way of looking at what I'm saying here. So, if you've been around here for a while, you know that one of the things that I'm passionate about, one of the things that we are passionate about at the church, is sharing the good news of Jesus with our community. We believe Jesus changes lives for the better. And we believe that there's lots of people that want to know about that don't know about that. People that are lonely for God. This is one of the ways in which God changes your relationships. But the truth is, we can't invite them in here if we can't get along with each other or get along with them. If we can't get along with people. And that's why this is so important, for us to learn how to get along, how to resolve conflict in a way that doesn't destroy us. And so, my challenge to you today is, would you be willing to move in this direction? Maybe you look at these 8 steps and go, whoa, I don't know if I could handle all 8 of those in one fell swoop. Is there one thing that you would be willing to do differently than you have in the past that would help move you towards healthier conflict resolution? I want you to ask God to help you, even if it's just with one thing. And whatever that one thing is that you feel like you're stirring in your heart right now and saying, yeah, I need to do this, I can do this, I will do this. I want you to write it down right now. Get a piece of paper out and put it in your notebook, put it in your whatever you need to. Just write it down so you don't forget it. I am committing myself today, the 24th of March, 2019, to do this one thing from now on, to have healthier relationships with my spouse or with other people as well. So that's my challenge for you today. So while you're thinking about that, worship team is going to lead us in a song here, and then we'll be on to coffee in a minute. But I want you to think about this and write something down before you leave here today. Can we do that? Okay.